Awesome. Well, great. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for filling out the poll if you did. I see lots of results still coming in here, so really appreciate the engagement and super awesome that we're finally having this virtual event for everybody. So my name is Josh, and I work with Ule on the developer advocacy team at Spotify. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite APIs, Spotify's Player API. And the Player API, if you've been using our APIs for a long time, you may know that the Player API is one of the newer categories of web APIs at Spotify. And so I'm really excited about the recent improvements that Oli mentioned, like the new queue endpoint. And one of the reasons I really like this API is because it empowers developers to make apps that control a really key interface of Spotify, which is the playback state and the ability to play or pause music. But it does a lot more than that as well. So on this screen here, I've shown a screenshot of the Spotify web player. If you haven't used a web player before, that's the interface at open.spotify.com, where you can listen to audio, manage your Spotify account and playlists. But the reason I wanted to include the screenshot along the bottom is that you can see along the bottom, there's a lot of different knobs and buttons and features that allow you to control playback of audio. And almost every single feature that you can see here along the bottom of the web player can be controlled programmatically using Spotify's Player APIs. So it's a really powerful part of the API that allows you to do some really rich user interface work if you want to. So let's talk in depth about some of the different APIs that are available through the Player API. The most obvious function of the Player API is it allows you to play or pause audio that's playing on a Spotify client, a third-party speaker, or even a virtual Spotify Connect device like a web playback SDK client. If you don't use Spotify as a user, one key concept to understand here is that each user listens to one thing at a time in their account, and each Spotify client gives you some window into what's happening with playback on your devices. So if you use the Player endpoint to start playback on, say, the web player, then you should be able to open your iOS app and see that playback is happening on the web player. So the systems are all in sync. And so the Play endpoint allows you to play podcast episodes or tracks, which you can send to the endpoint by ID. Each of these entities has a Spotify ID. And when you make the put request to the player/play endpoint, you can include a list of podcast episode IDs or track IDs for Spotify to begin playing. You can also use the player/play API to play what we call a context, which is a set of entities that Spotify will play for the user in a row. Some of the valid contexts that are supported by the Player API include playlists, albums, artists, and podcast shows. And the Play API also includes some really nice features that help you to customize your playback play command. So for example, you can start playback. By default, it begins at 0.0 in the track, but you can choose to begin playback at a specific point in the track, say 10 seconds in, if you want to. You can also provide an offset so that if you're starting playback with a context, then you can begin, for example, playing the second track in the playlist. Along the bottom here, you can see user modify playback state. And this represents the OAuth scope that you'll need to have assigned to your app in order to use the player/play or player/pause endpoints. So of course, if your application hopes to start playback of a user's audio, then the user will have to approve the modify playback state scope before your app can do that. And in Ibtisam session, she'll be talking a little bit more about OAuth and how the authorization code flow works. One important limitation to know about these two endpoints and several other endpoints under the Player API category is that these endpoints are for Spotify Premium users only. So Spotify free users won't be able to call these endpoints using their user accounts. And the pause endpoint, it has fewer options than the play endpoint, and it does just what the name suggests. It pauses music that's currently playing or podcast episodes which you can then resume if you choose using the player/play endpoint. So you can use the player API to take actions on playback state, but you can also use the player API to fetch information about what's playing. And the me/player endpoint and the me/player devices endpoint allow you to do exactly that. So with the me/player endpoint, you can get the current player state, including the context, if there's a context playing. You can see which device is playing. You can see how loud or what the volume is of playback. And then you can even see the progress of playback. So how many milliseconds into playback the current track is. And then using the player/devices endpoint, you can list the user's active Spotify Connect devices. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, you can use this, the Connect APIs to control third-party speakers. You can use them to control web clients like the web player. And you can use it to even control your own virtual Spotify Connect device created using the Web Playback SDK. And then these endpoints also allow you to see the currently playing content type, which, as we'll talk about later, can be very important if you're looking to build a high quality now playing view for users. One really nice thing about these endpoints is that these are kind of the endpoints of the player API that are available to free users. So these endpoints can be called by Spotify Premium users or Spotify free users. Tokens from either type of account will work. So if you choose, you can use the player API to skip forwards or backwards within a context if a context is playing. For example, to skip forward to the next track in an album, or to skip backwards to the previous track in the album. And you can do that using the player/next and player/previous endpoints. These endpoints are for Spotify Premium users only as well. And they require the user modify playback state scope as well. So similar permission to the player/play endpoint for scopes you'll have to ask users for. One important thing to note about the player/previous endpoint is that you might guess, as I did, that the player/previous endpoint would reset playback of the current track to 0. In fact, the player/previous endpoint will begin playing the previous track in the context from 0. So if you want to start the current track over again and move back to position 0 in the current track, then you'll want to use another endpoint. And that endpoint, the endpoint you could use to do that, to reset playback position of the current track to 0, would be the put player/seek endpoint. This is, again, a really powerful endpoint because it allows you to move the playback position to a specific millisecond within the song or the podcast episode that's playing in the user's account. So if your application does have a progress bar, then sometimes that's a use case for player/seek, where developers will use it. And again, this is another endpoint that's for premium users only, and the modify playback state scope is again relevant here. So another feature that you will have seen in the screenshot that I shared of the web player is the ability to adjust the repeat state of playback. And as you can guess, we support that using the player API too. So the player/repeat endpoint can be used to assign the repeat state to repeat the currently playing track or podcast episode, to repeat the currently playing context, or you can, of course, use that endpoint to disable repeat as well. And then we touched on this earlier. You can also use the player API to adjust volume of playback, again, on a device or on a Spotify client. And when you make a request to the player/volume endpoint, you can send a device volume score between 0 and 100. And then that will set the Spotify volume to the value that you defined. The player API also supports adjusting the shuffle state of playback. So if you're playing a context, like a playlist or a set of shows, then you can use this endpoint to begin shuffling playback rather than playing them in order. Or you can use the shuffle endpoint to disable shuffling as well. So it allows you to toggle the state of shuffling. Uli mentioned this endpoint in his session. So the player/queue endpoint is the newest endpoint of the player API. And I'm really excited about this one because it allows you to add a song or an episode to your play queue, as we call it in the web player. The queue of tracks or episodes that the user will listen to next in their Spotify account. So this is a really fun endpoint for building, for example, social listening applications. Really excited about this one. One important limitation to know here is that we don't yet have an endpoint for reading the queue, so listing the current items in the queue, or an endpoint for modifying the queue or clearing it. So be very careful about what you add to the queue because there's no endpoint yet for erasing or for modifying the tracks you've added. Awesome. So those were some of the endpoints I wanted to highlight in the player API. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the response codes that you'll see from this API, because I think this is a topic that users sometimes find to be a little bit different from some of the other APIs that we have at Spotify. So every response that you get back from Spotify's API should include a response code. And one of the codes that hopefully you'll see the most of is 200 OK. You'll see this code if you successfully receive some data from Spotify, like you've fetched the player state, or you've successfully fetched a list of devices. Another success code that you might see is 204 no content. So it's another 200 series code, which tells us that this is another kind of happy response code, but it does indicate that it can indicate in some cases that an action is still being processed, or that there is no active device. So you will see a 204 response, for example, if you use the previous API or the next API. And an important thing to note here is that when you do use those APIs, there can sometimes still be an error after you've called the previous or the next command. So if you need to be absolutely sure that the previous command has worked or the next command has worked, then you'll want to use the player the player API to see what track is currently playing or what episode is currently playing to make sure that it worked. Another response code that you might see would be 401 unauthorized. So this typically indicates that there has been an issue with the authorization process, or maybe the token you've received has expired. So if you do get the 401 unauthorized error, then do some debugging on the access code or the access token that you got, and take a fresh look at the authorization code flow as well. Another code that exists with the player API is 403 forbidden. So this is the code that you'll see if you're attempting to call a premium only endpoint from a free Spotify account. One useful thing to know here is that with the 403 code, if you look in the response body, you can actually find extra information often about why you're receiving a 403 response from the API call that you made. And that's a pretty good tip, I think, for all of the kind of API responses of concern. If you've gotten a code that you don't quite understand, then definitely take a look at the response body to see if there's any help text there that can help you identify and debug the issue that you're experiencing. So another code that you'll see, or you could see with the player API, is 404 not found. So this is a code that you'll see most obviously when if there's an issue with misspelling the endpoint that you're trying to call, which is a mistake that I made earlier this week. Then you'll see a 404 not found error. But with the player API, you'll also see the 404 response in certain circumstances, like when you're trying to play content without an active device, or if there are no active devices to fetch. So 404 not found doesn't always indicate an issue with the path. It could also indicate that a device is missing or another piece of information is missing that we're trying to communicate to you. And then You might from time to time come across a 500 series server error. Hopefully this will be fairly rare for you in your app development, but this typically indicates an issue on Spotify's side. So if you do come across a large number of 500 series errors, make sure you take a look at status.spotify.dev to see if there are any reported or active issues. And if there aren't, and if you're seeing a consistent 500 error from your application, then be sure to let us know in the developer forum. That's really useful for us. And it could help us catch a bug quicker than we otherwise would. So as Uli mentioned, we recently updated the design guidelines for folks who are building third-party apps with Spotify. And the design team included a few really good tips about how to build a great now playing view that I thought were useful to include. One really good point that they've included is that in some cases, it may make sense to delegate or to defer a particular UX activity to the Spotify app, especially if you're building a mobile application for third-party for users. And what I mean by this is that, for example, you may not want to implement all of the different controls that you see in the web player. It may make sense to move some of the controls like the skip functionality, the shuffle functionality, or the ability to change the repeat state. It may make sense to just leave those out of your application and let the user open the Spotify app to adjust those settings of playback. And that brings a lot of benefits. I mean, as a developer, it's helpful because it means less code in my app. And then if it's a feature that users infrequently use, then it may also be helpful for them because they can use it in Spotify where they may be already familiar with using the repeat button or another one of these features. One suggestion they made that I think is really good as well is that if you are prioritizing elements to include in a now playing view, having a like option or a favorite option is a really good option to include because that allows users to save content to their Spotify library. So if you've used Spotify before, then you may have seen this as a heart icon in Spotify mobile clients. And our design guidelines now include graphics that you can use for the heart icon if you want to implement that in your third-party app. So if you're thinking of including a like option or favorite option, check out the design guidelines for those graphics because you can use those. And then lastly, there's a really good suggestion here around adapting the playback controls for different types of content. So if users are listening to a podcast episode, they may expect to see different controls from what controls they would see when they're listening to an audio track. Most obviously, one suggestion that is in our design guidelines is to include the skip options to skip forward 15 seconds or skip back 15 seconds when you are playing a podcast episode for users. So you can use the player API to see exactly what type of content is playing and then adapt the user interface accordingly so that users see the controls that they expect to see when certain types of content are playing. Cool. So that was a lot of detail around the player API endpoints. I made a simple demo of the player API that I want to show you all. So this will be a little bit risky. Fingers crossed that my demo app still works. Before I show you the demo app, I want to tell you a little bit about how I made it. If you've used any of Spotify's code samples on Glitch before, then you may have seen this particular code sample. This was a code sample made by one of my talented coworkers, which allows developers to stream audio in the browser using the Web Playback SDK. It does not, however, allow the user to control playback. So there's no option here for starting playback, for pausing playback, for forwarding or going backwards at track. Those options aren't here. So what I've done is I've adapted this code sample to do almost the opposite of what it does now. Instead of streaming, it will allow the user to control playback on another device. In my case, it will be Spotify's desktop app, but it won't stream audio itself. It will just control playback on another device. And as we talked about earlier, you can combine the Web Playback SDK with the player API endpoints to build a really rich user experience where users can control playback and also stream audio from a third-party app. So if you wanted to, you could combine this example with the example I'm about to show you to kind of build something much bigger. So in order to do this, I made some changes, like I said, to the sample code that you may have seen on Glitch. So I created a new component called the rewind button. And this was probably the simplest change or the simplest component I made. So this component displays a rewind button on the interface of the application. And I don't have a fancy user interface here. So the rewind button is just an emoji to skip backwards a track. And it listens for clicks on the button, which will trigger a call to the player/previous API that we spoke about earlier. And it will make a post command to that API without any options or without any, I should say, URL parameters or body parameters with it. So the player/previous API here is being used in a very simple way to skip backwards a track. Then I also added a component for the play button. And then this was a little bit more complicated for me because what I wanted to do was make sure that when we show the play button to the user, we're showing either a play button in the case of audio not currently playing for the user, or we're showing a pause button if audio is already playing in the user's account. So in order to do that, when this component loads, you can see here that we're making a call out to the me/player API to fetch information about the current playback state. And what we're doing is we're taking the isPlaying property from the player API, and we're assigning that to the state of this component so that this component will know if audio is currently playing in the user's account or not. So like the previous component that I showed you, we are using emojis. I didn't design any UI components for this. So it will display either a pause button or a play button, depending on whether or not the audio is playing in the user's account already. And then again, depending on the state, the tapping on the button will either pause audio or play audio in the user's account. And you might notice here that we're not actually including many options here again either. So all of the fancy settings around starting playback from a particular song, starting playback of a context with a offset, we're not including any of that here. And that's one of the things I really like about this API is that it can be used very simply or with many different options. And if audio is already playing in the user's browser or in the user's account, then tapping on the pause button will make a call to the v1/me/player/pause endpoint instead, which again is very simple. It's just a put request without anything in the body. So let's take a look. Hopefully it still works. And I'm just going to open up the application here. So it's running locally on my computer. And hopefully you can see the application. And I'm going to tap on the login with Spotify button. So I didn't talk much about authentication. And I know Ibtisam will cover this in more detail in her talk. But this is the type of screen that a user will see when they install a third-party application that uses player API related scopes. So we can see here that the application is asking for access to view what's currently playing in my Spotify account, information about the devices I have in my account, and it's asking for the ability to take actions in Spotify on my behalf, including the ability to stream and control Spotify on my devices. So quite a few permissions here. I trust this app, so I'm going to tap agree. And now we can see here the components that we were talking about earlier. I also built a third component for skipping forwards, but I didn't show you the code because it's very similar to the rewind component that we looked at. And it says here that audio is already playing in my Spotify account. And we know that because it's a pause button here rather than a play button. And And if I go over to the Spotify desktop app, which I have conveniently open, we can see that, yes, there is audio playing in the background here. So I am listening to a podcast at the moment, very quietly. So every time you waste a byte, I can turn up the audio in the Spotify client. This is Spotify, a product store. And again, like we talked about, this should be in sync with what the application is fetching from the API. So let's see if these components actually work for pausing and for moving forwards or backwards a track. So I tapped on the pause button and it looks like it did what we were expecting. It managed to pause playback in the Spotify desktop client. So that's great. Let's see if moving backwards a track works. Great, and again, we can see that moving backwards seems to work the way that I expect. So the previous endpoint is working the way that we talked about earlier, in that it doesn't reset playback of the current track, it moves back a track or back an episode in the current context. And then just for completeness, let's check out the last component and see if the next operation works as well. Yep, it seems to work, so that's great. And if I go into Chrome Developer Tools here, it looks like almost all of these calls worked. So that's great. And we can see here that when we were making requests to the pause endpoint, we got a 204 response like we were talking about earlier. So that's really good to see. And we also made calls to the play endpoint, which came back with also a 204 response, which is another, again, it's a success status code. So yeah, that's the demo of the quick Connect application that I built. I hope this is inspiring for some of you. And I'm going to tune into the questions that we have in Zoom and see if there's any questions here that I can answer that you may have about building apps with the Player API. Great, and I'm just looking through the questions here. So here's a great question. Can we activate a private session via the web API or SDK? No, so that's not an option that we have in the Player API at the moment. Good question, though. I would be really interested to learn more about the use case that you might have for that feature request. And then we have another question here. The Connect API is great. Thank you. Not that I built it, but glad you're enjoying it. I've been using it for a project. Are there any plans for starting a private session via an endpoint? Okay, so there's another feature request there for starting private sessions via the web API. So that's not currently an option that we have with the Player API. But since there's a couple of feature requests here for that, then I'll definitely bring it up with the team and make sure to share that feedback. And then there's a question here, is there any way to know when a song ended with the Player API? So at the moment, not exactly. So you would just have to know that you'd have to keep track of the current state with your application. And you could call the Player API to see if another song is playing or another episode, but there's no way to receive a notification at this point that a song is ended or that an episode is ended, for example. Great, so there's a question here is, can I build an application that allows people to listen to music on my website? So yes, you can use the player/play API to begin playback of a track ID or a episode ID that you specify in the request to the player/play API. So it allows you to play an arbitrary track. You just need to know the Spotify ID, which you can use our other APIs like the search API to find out. Is there a way to manipulate, create, or edit playlists? Yes, absolutely. So I didn't include this in the conversation today about the Player API, but we have a separate set of APIs for managing playlists. And you can certainly use those to create playlists, edit playlists, reorder playlists. All those amazing features are available too. So if you have a look at developer.spotify.com and find your way to the web API documentation, then you can learn a bit more about how to help users manage their playlists. Great, it looks like those are most of the questions that folks have answered or folks have asked. So Really appreciate you all coming out to today's session. I think we have another poll that we're going to ask before the next talk. So I'm going to see if we can share the next poll, and then Ibtisam will be joining us at 8:45 Stockholm time for the next session in the event today.